afternoon, everyone. Today, we are celebrating the observance of World Wildlife Day under the theme, Restoring Key Species for Ecosystem Restoration. This theme seeks to highlight the status of some of the most critically endangered species of wild fauna and flora and their role in ecosystems. According to data from the International Union for Conservation of Nature, also known as IUCN, Red List of Threatened Species, over 8,400 species of wild fauna and flora are critically endangered, while close to 30,000 more are understood to be endangered or vulnerable. Based on these estimates, it is suggested that over 1 million species are threatened with extinction. This is an alarming statistic when we consider how important these species are to ensuring life on Earth is maintained. Wildlife and their habitats contribute to ecosystem services that make it possible for us to get materials for food and medicine, clean water, clean air, and also assist in regulation of climate. Millions of people depend on wildlife resources to meet their everyday needs, from food to fuel, medicines, housing, and clothing. Additionally, many people rely on wildlife for their livelihoods and economic opportunities. These include hunters, trappers, middlemen, forest dwellers, miners, and fishermen. However, activities such as poaching, unregulated forestry and mining, and agricultural expansion threaten the survival of these key species. Since they are so important, the continued loss of species, habitats, and ecosystems threatens all life on Earth, including ours. As such, the theme for World Wildlife Day this year will also highlight the impact of conservation efforts and promote best practice examples where species were brought back from the brink. And it will drive discussions towards imagining and implementing new solutions to conserve and sustainably use others. Today, I am privileged to be joined by professionals from government and non-governmental organizations whose work is related to wildlife conservation. Together, we will embark on a discussion about the work of the organizations they represent and how it has contributed to the conservation of key species in Guyana. Firstly, I introduce to you Mr. Johann Waldron. Mr. Johann Waldron has been employed as a research officer at the Wildlife Conservation and Management Commission for the past 4 years. Johann has a master's in natural resource management, marine and terrestrial ecosystems from the University of the West Indies. He is passionate about teaching the youth of conservation and wildlife. He enjoys scuba diving and is most at home in his wetsuit or field boots. Secondly, we have Mr. Neal Millar, who is the program coordinator for the South Rupununi Conservation Society and has been with the organization for the past 3 years. Neal is responsible for overseeing all aspects of the South Rupununi Conservation Society, including project management, fundraising, capacity development, and stakeholder relations. Included in his role, Neal has helped SRCS to establish the first important bird area in Guyana, create one of the first community-based conservation management zones in the country, and to publish a guidebook on mammals of the Rupununi. Prior to joining SRCS, Neal worked as a research assistant with the Energy, Environment and Resources Department at Chatham House in London. Next, we have Dr. Gyanpriya Maharaj. Dr. Maharaj is an entomologist and a behavioral ecologist by training, and her research spanning the last decade includes work that investigates the biodiversity and population ecology of terrestrial and aquatic insects. This research heavily focuses on neotropical butterflies, where she has investigated the diversity, behavior, genetics, physiology, and ecology of many local species. Currently, Her research emphasizes decision-making in pollinators as it relates to foraging behaviors. In addition to her research experience, she functions in an administrative and teaching capacity at the University of Guyana and sits on several national biodiversity and environmental related boards and national working groups related to biodiversity data collection, use, and policy. And finally, we have Ms. Felicia Collins, who is a Protected Areas Officer at the Protected Areas Commission. Ms. Collins is attached to the Shell Beach Protected Area and has the responsibility of community engagement. She hails from the small community of Port Kaituma in Region 1 and holds a bachelor's degree in biology with specializations in marine and environmental biology. Panelists, thank you for accepting the invitation to sit on this panel as we discuss key issues related to biodiversity and wildlife conservation, specifically linked to this year's World Wildlife Day's theme, recovering key species for ecosystem restoration. Our first point of discussion today will be about the role your organization plays in wildlife conservation and ecosystem restoration in Guyana. And so the first question I pose to you is, what role does your organization play in wildlife conservation and ecosystem restoration in Guyana? We're going to start with Mr. Waldron first.
Thank you, Mr. Hughes, and good afternoon, fellow panelists and everyone looking. Here at the Wildlife Commission, we play the role of the national implementing body as it relates to the management, conservation, and sustainable use of wildlife in Guyana. Now, what that entails is, for example, managing local utilization for sustainable use for purposes such as hunting as well as for pets, and also implementing the rules and regulations that are part of the international trade of wildlife for both flora and fauna. As it relates to the role that we play in ecosystem restoration, our role is more species-based, particularly for fauna. So we would have implemented in recent years open and closed seasons for species that we have found to be targeted, whereas prior to that, there were no set seasons. So at any point in time, it could have been during the breeding season, a mother with young by themselves, could have been targeted for whatever purpose those seeking them would be seeking them for. However, as a result of the implementation of the open and closed seasons, that is no longer the case. The seasons were tailored using both local knowledge as well as documented literature to encompass the particular period between breeding and when the young animals would be able to, or would be of age to fend for themselves, thereby facilitating some amount of rehabilitation of the species in areas where they are targeted, particularly so in areas where they are more heavily targeted. So those would be some of the initiatives that the Commission has undertaken as it relates to species conservation and ecosystem restoration. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Waldron. Now I'll go to Dr. Maharaj. So Dr. Maharaj, yes, I know you're the head of the CSBD at UG. So tell us, what is the role of CSBD?
So the role of CSBD can be captured in three main areas. The first role is that we engage in and we support the documentation of biodiversity throughout the entire country. The CSBD houses the National Research Collection, and this includes a wet museum, a dry museum, and a herbarium. These research collection allows for research by our students at the university and by visiting researchers. In addition to our research collection and the collection of data, We also are involved in biodiversity education, and we're involved in biodiversity education in various levels. We work with schools, primarily high schools, where we do targeted visits to our collection, and we will teach them about biodiversity and biodiversity collection methods. We also do training at the university level at both graduate and undergraduate, where we teach students about collection methods, we teach students about data analysis, and we teach students about the writing of scientific papers. Because of course, if you're going to collect this data, you'd have to be able to share this information with others. And finally, we support many conservation efforts in Guyana by doing research ourselves and through management, partnership, and even policy advocacy. And I think that sums up the major roles of CSBD as it relates to studying biodiversity within the country and supporting conservation. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Now, Mr. Millar, if you can tell us a little bit about the work of the SRCS. I know you're based in the South Rupununi, but you can go ahead and share more about the SRCS and your role.
Sure, thank you very much, Mr. Hughes. Good afternoon, fellow panelists, and good afternoon to everybody watching. So the South Rupununi Conservation Society was formed 20 years ago here in the South Rupununi, and it was formed really in response to a group of friends from various communities across the South Rupununi were noticing a decline in the number of wildlife species they were seeing, the quantity of wildlife, and they were also starting to see the degradation of the local environment. So in response to this, they formed the South Rupununi Conservation Society. The society is primarily made up of the indigenous residents here of the South Rupununi, but we also have members from across Guyana and even internationally as well. Of course, I am not indigenous, but my position really is to increase the capacity of SRCS, so they will be able to really local people from here in their communities could lead the future of SRCS going forward in the coming years. How SRCS works is that we have a number of communities here in the South Rupununi and even throughout the Rupununi who contact us and they have an issue or a problem with particular wildlife species or somewhere in their environment. They will contact us and ask for our collaboration so that we can assist them with our scientific knowledge. They can assist with their local knowledge to make a conservation plan to either reverse the decline of a particular population or to improve the quality of their environment. So examples of projects that we are currently doing, we work with the red siskin, we work with communities on the yellow spotted river turtle, we work with communities on the giant anteater, and all of these species have been either are being seen to be in decline or are under serious threat. So as mentioned, we work with communities to make a plan for them, and we use local persons from those communities that we train in the scientific methods to implement strategies and projects to see a population reversal and improvement in their ecosystems and environment. So I guess that's the overall function and aim of SRCS, that we are really trying to preserve the environment, we're trying to preserve wildlife, and we're also preserving culture. And all three of those are not independent, they're all interlinked things that go hand in hand. So yeah, that's an overall picture of SRCS and what we're doing here in not only the South Rupununi, but in the Rupununi as a whole.
Thank you very much. And now, Ms. Collins, tell us a little bit more about the PAC, or Protected Areas Commission.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So the Protected Areas Commission is responsible for establishing and managing the protected areas in Guyana. Currently, we have 5 protected areas, 3 of which the PAC is directly responsible for. There is the Kaieteur National Park, the Kunuku Mountains Protected Area, and the Shell Beach Protected Area. All 3 of these protected areas fall under Category 6 of the IUCN protection status, which means it's a managed resource protected area. So we support the conservation of biodiversity. We also support sustainable resource use and livelihood developments. Specifically to the Shell Beach Protected Area, it's Guyana's only coastal protected area. And there we have our sea turtle conservation monitoring program, which of course monitors the flagship conservation species, the marine turtles. And 4 of the 7 marine turtles come to the Shell Beach Protected Areas to nest every season. In addition to that, though, the Shell Beach Protected Area is a large and vast space, not just comprising of sandy shores, but it also has part of the largest intact mangrove system found in Guyana. And within those mangrove forests, we can also find a lot of other ecologically important species, such as jaguars. We have the endangered West Indian manatee, there are otters, and numerous other birds and amphibians and reptiles as well. So the work of the PAC, I think it's not just about supporting biodiversity and making areas. I guess people often think that it's when you're given a protection status that it's limited from people to use the resources. But the Protected Areas Commission does encourage sustainable resource use and also the livelihood developments of surrounding communities. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And that was very informative because, I mean, at least for like the Shell Beach Protected Area, for instance, when persons hear of that, they usually think immediately of the leatherback turtle or sea turtles, but it's good that you mentioned that there are actually other species that are actually benefiting from that area being a protected area. All right, so we'll move on to our next question, and that is, what wildlife-related priorities has your organization been focused on in the last 5 to 10 years? So what specific work has the organization been doing within 5 to 10 years that would have led to the conservation of wildlife in Guyana? I'll ask Mr. Millar to respond firstly to this question.
Sure. So I should be a little bit cheeky and go actually 20 years back, seeing as we've been farmed for the last 20 years. And at the same time as the South Rupununi Conservation Society was formed, the scientific discovery of a small red seed finch known as the red siskin was found in the South Rupununi. And at the time, it was a very remarkable discovery because this bird was considered critically endangered in the world by the IUCN Red List. And it could only be found really in Venezuela, but at that point, it couldn't even be found in the wild. So it's very surprising to find a healthy population of red siskins so far away from Venezuela and only in the South Rupununi. That they've searched for in the North Rupununi, they searched for in Brazil, in southern Venezuela, and they can't find this species here. So at the coincidental time-in of the farming of the SRCS and the red siskin, that became the #1 and starting priority for SRCS. Because so little information was known about the red siskin here in Guyana, and because it was critically endangered. So over the last 20 years with the red siskin, we've collected an abundance of scientific data on the red siskin. That was new to science. We actually found that the red siskin you find here in the South Rupununi is actually genetically different from the one that you find in Venezuela. So while it's the same species, they have genetic differences. If you were to collect blood samples from both, you could tell the difference, which is actually very important for when you're trying to stop trading of species. So if you find the bird in Brazil and you take blood samples, you would be able to tell if it came from Guyana or if it came from Venezuela. We collected information about their home range, their diet, their behavior. We also did a mark recapture survey to do population estimates. So now we have a good understanding of how many red siskins they have in the South Rupununi. And because of those initiatives and discoveries, we've had a lot of achievements. So for example, the red siskin is no longer critically endangered, it's become endangered. We were able, like I said, to be able to confirm the first important bird area in Guyana. And in the coming weeks, we'll actually confirm the same area, the South Central Rupununi, as the first key biodiversity area, or one of the first in Guyana. However, with the popularity of the red siskin, we've also seen As more people are aware of the bird, more threats it occurs. We see a lot of habitat destruction where they're found. We also see some level of trapping and trading as well. So our most recent priority has been to work with the local indigenous communities that can be found throughout the range of the red siskin to create a community-based conservation management zone. So although the red siskin is officially protected in Guyana, it's illegal to trap and trade. It still happens, and because the capacity of monitoring institutions is very difficult to cover the wide area of Guyana. So that's where local communities can come in and manage the wildlife themselves. We are helping them to give the capacity. So now they've established a set of rules that there'll be no habitat destruction of red siskin sites. There'll be no trapping of the red siskin for any purpose. So now we're being able to afford more protection to red siskin, and our priority for the next few years is to monitor this conservation zone with the local communities found in their range to hopefully get a further increase in the red siskin population. In addition to red siskin, as I mentioned before, SRCS works all the time in collaboration with other communities. So we wait for these indigenous communities to approach us and tell us the problem that they're having with a decline in a particular wildlife species. So for example, in Katunra village, they approached us and told us that they're seeing a decline in the giant anteater species. They're seeing less than they did in years before. So we created a scientific methodology. We collected data on the giant anteater. So we found out a baseline population for giant anteaters that you're actually able to do, because all giant anteaters are unique. So you can actually tell the difference between two individual giant anteaters because of the marking on their bodies. So using camera trap surveys and other techniques, you can actually tell the difference between these anteaters and create a population estimate from that. And similar to the red siskin conservation zone, we've now established a giant anteater conservation zone with Katunra village, where the same thing applies. There are certain rules created by the village that the village will now enforce using rangers trained by SRCS in their community. And actually the launching of that zone will happen on Sunday at Katunra's first Nature Day. Other important species to us, we have the yellow-spotted river turtle. This is a species that's been heavily in decline because it's a very popular joke is that back in the 1980s, one fisherman could go out and in one hunting period, he could collect 200 turtles. And now 200 people could go out and they might only catch one turtle. It's not so severe like that, but that's the joke. So our priority now is to work with Sand Creek Village. We've trained rangers from that community, and they are now monitoring beaches along the Rupununi River to protect the yellow-spotted river turtle, not only from humans, but also from flooding, which destroys their nests. And it's happening even more so now due to climate change, and also from other wildlife predators. And the final two species I would mention, as they're very important, are the hoary-throated spine-tail and the Rio Branco antbird. So these are Guyana's only two critically endangered species, and they're actually endemic to a small area of land that straddles the border between Brazil and southern Guyana along the Irang River. And only up until last year, there was no population estimate of these two birds in Guyana. So we didn't even know how much we had or the threats they were facing, but we did a population estimate last year and a habitat assessment. And we see that actually the habitat area of these two birds is decreasing over time due to fire, due to small scale agriculture and a few other reasons. So our priority now is to work with these local landowners and in nearby indigenous communities who share the land with these two species to again do a similar thing to hopefully create a community conservation zone that has a set of rules that we can monitor, and hopefully that will lead to the habitat restoration of the area that was lost, and you'll see an increase in these two critically endangered species. So for now, that's the kind of 5 priority species that we're working with. As I said, as communities approach us, that list grows bigger.
All right, thank you very much for sharing. Really comprehensive work that you guys have been doing, as you mentioned, over the last 20 years. Now, Ms. Collins, what can you tell us about what has been happening at Shell Beach?
Right, so our research priorities at the Shell Beach Protected Area are mainly centered around the turtles. the marine turtles that nest along the beaches. And over the years, since PAC has been managing the Shell Beach Protected Area, we have really begun to intensify our research because of climate change and because of how they are affecting the turtles. So most of our research is focused along the coast. However, as of recently, we have also been looking at more research in our mangrove forests and in the swamps and the wetland areas. We are setting in the phase of setting camera traps to really understand, you know, what are the animals there, their activity patterns, their distribution, their abundance, and to just understand a bit more of how healthy the ecosystem is and what is where. In addition to that, we also have research priorities for the Shell Beach Protected Area that we have, and we encourage persons, university students, even foreign universities, if they approach us, to maybe help us, or just if they're interested in carrying out any of the research priorities that we have, because we also have so much more studies to do on our coastal and migratory birds there. We have those priorities there for persons who are interested to help us get some of the research done. But for the past few years, our research has been heavily focused on the marine turtles.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maharaj. I'll let you to go next.
Well, I think it's well fitting that I go after Ms. Collins, because one of our main area that we have when we look at wildlife priorities is promotion of research. And one of the things that we work on through our educational programs at all levels is the systematic collection of biodiversity, and how do we publish that those data that would have been collected. And when I say publish, I'm not only referring to publishing those data in scientific articles, but publishing, whether it is creating checklists, or whether it is creating an identification manual, or whether it is something as simple as creating a poster or a PowerPoint presentation, where information that's collected from research, whether it is research with staff, or it is joint research done with international parties, or it is research done with our students, it's something that is a very, very important priority to us. The reason that it's such a big priority is because what we would like to promote in the long run is to have data that is collected over long periods of time in selected areas, so that we can have trend data. And when we have those trend data, we can now make decisions, informed decisions based on those data, on policies relating to the ecosystem and species within those areas. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Waldron, what has the GWCMC been up to?
Over the last 5 to 10 years, or within that space, the GWCMC has had a few initiatives as it relates to the, could you repeat the question for me, please? Sorry.
Yeah, so what wildlife-related priorities has the organization focused on in the last 5 to 10 years?
All right, thank you. So the wildlife-related priorities that we focused on would be the introduction of the open and closed seasons, as I would have mentioned beforehand, in order to better conserve and sustainably utilize our species. We have also been addressing areas of conflict where there is human-wildlife conflict, whether it be conflict with jaguars, conflict with caiman, conflict with monkeys. We have also been looking at introducing a domestic licensing system to have a better idea of our stakeholders and how it is that they interact with wildlife. We have also had more public engagement than before, again, addressing perspectives towards wildlife and bringing more awareness to both stakeholders and the general public as it relates to the benefits of the both wild flora and fauna that we have, as well as how they can do their part in helping to conserve and protect those animals and plants on which we tend to depend, and so that, you know, when they get grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the great-grandchildren will need to see a picture of a macaw and then ask somebody, oh, what is this bird? I've never seen this bird before. So we are hoping that with our initiatives thus far, and with continued partnership with other agencies as well, because this is by no means a one-man endeavor. So we're hoping that with those initiatives and with continued partnership, we are going to continue seeing, for example, the parrots and macaws that we tend to see from time to time flying right over central Georgetown for many years to come. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And I think, as each of you would have elaborated, you know, the work of these various organizations, they are very important when it comes to wildlife conservation in Guyana. You know, as Mr. Millar, as you would have mentioned, the different species that the SRCS has been focusing on, and the important role that it plays in indigenous culture, you know, and their livelihoods. Even at Shell Beach, and you know, Dr. Maharaj, you would have mentioned the importance of research, right? We know that each of the species that you know you guys are focusing on, they are important, and we know that from the GWCMC level, right? Our act actually mandates us to set aside what we call protected species, right? And those are species that are categorized as vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered on the IUCN Red List. And it is actually illegal for persons to hunt or to trade or to even molest these animals or species in general in any way, because we know wildlife includes both animals and plants. And so, you know, it really shows that the work of wildlife conservation is very important, but it also takes numerous strategies from and the work of different organizations to actually achieve the goal of wildlife conservation. And so, even as we dwell on that, I'd like for you guys to discuss now, what challenges have you faced or has your organization faced while executing your work? What challenges has your organization faced while executing your work? And I'm going to start with Ms. Collins on this one.
So most of our challenges at the Shell Beach Protected Area are environmental challenges because of the nature of Shell Beach. It's rough. The Atlantic Ocean is very rough, and just to get out there on the beach to do monitoring poses a challenge. And for those who don't know, the Shell Beach stretches over 120 kilometers along Guyana's coastline. So it's a very large area, and within that 120 km, there are different beaches or different sites that the turtles would go to nest every season. And these beaches change constantly because of the natural erosion accretion processes of the beach. But we've also seen it intensified with climate change, and that recently has posed a threat to us and our sea turtle monitoring program. Our current beach that we monitor out of our main beach would be the Almond Beach, which is the first beach. And the next beach, or the next closest beach, is about 80 kilometers east. So it's a very far away, and the ocean can be very rough sometimes. So a lot of times the challenges for us is that it's dangerous, and the environment can be harsh sometimes. But of course, we continue to do the work, and we have to follow the turtles. So wherever the turtles are, that's where we will go. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you know, as you said, we have to do the work. Eh? I mean, it might be challenging, and of course there will be challenges as you know, as we will now elaborate on. But regardless of the challenges, we have to continue pressing on, because So the conservation of wildlife is important to us as humans as well. So, Mr. Waldron, what challenges has your organization faced?
This one could turn out to be a potentially long list, but I'll try to keep it short. I would say one of the major challenges that we face is the perception of our populace towards wildlife. Of not our entire populace, sorry, but for what seems to be a very large volume of our population. I can recall as a child, before getting involved in the conservation field, and even from time to time now via social media, you would see instances, or I would see instances where people would drag a caiman out of a trench and have vehicles roll over it just because. Or someone would catch a snake and it's a snake, so it has to die. You ask them why they killed the snake. Oh, it's a snake. You can bite it and kill you. I'm like, you do know that not all snakes can kill you just like that, right? They're like, well, but I mean, you know, all I know is that it's a snake, and if it's a snake, it's not dead. However, there are some cases where you can see that maybe there's a little bit of impact, or the curiosity to deviate from what seems to be the norm is there. Most recently, we would have had a case where there was a green turtle that ended up in, was it Larry Trait? I think it was Larry Trait, one of the villages along the west bank of the Millar going towards Wales. And we were called after it was posted up on social media. So initially there was a video of the turtle being found in the trench. And then after we would have did some investigation and made contact, we got a second video where the turtle was released, and it was quite heartening to see, especially with the Guyanese commentary, because at one point, and I mean, forgiving the fact that people were straddling the wheelbarrow to take pictures with the turtle. To begin with, it was in a wheelbarrow. How many times would you see a sea turtle in a wheelbarrow? And then when it was taken out of the wheelbarrow, and you know, it seemed to be moving a bit slowly towards the Demerara River. You heard someone in the background say, "Oh, buddy, the man tired, man. The man went in here long, you know, the man is tired. Y'all gotta give you a push." You know, so you tend to see the enthusiasm there. And so what we did was we were able to make contact with the agency that had covered the incident. And we went into the community, and we had a sort of community talk where we engaged the persons that were there. You know, we answered questions, we asked questions, and we learned a lot. And we said thank you, because it isn't very common for you to see that kind of interaction. In many cases, like a few instances we had beforehand, again a sea turtle. I think this time it was a hawksbill, I believe. I think it was a hawksbill. Nets were set on purpose to capture the hawksbill because it was seen in the vicinity of the Kingston foreshore. And the plan was to cook it. When it was caught, the plan was to cook it. However, somebody got wind of it and may or may not have purchased the turtle for about $2,000, thankfully. And we were able to, through partnership again with the Coast Guard as well as the Guyana Marine Conservation Society, have the turtle taken out to the mouth of the Demerara River and released into the Atlantic. So perception is one of the more daunting challenges that we face, and how we deal with that perception and impact it. Accessibility, in many cases, as Felicia would have outlined, can also pose a challenge. So some terrestrial and riverine terrains are almost impassable dependent on the season in which you encountered it. Not to mention that Guyana is not all flat land, and in many cases, some of the animals that you look for aren't found on flat land either, or the plants. The staff component can also be another challenge that is faced. Guyana, while not considered one of the larger countries, is kind of big. So imagine having, let's say, about 10 people to cover the entirety of Guyana and to monitor wildlife-related activities or to enforce the the entire mandate of the commission. That is a bit of an uphill task, one which, regardless, we do take on because, again, as Ms. Collins would have said, the work has to be done. And so we tend to find intuitive and ingenious ways of doing it. In terms of challenges, I would say those three encompass the larger base of the challenges that we face at the Wildlife Commission. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Waldron. Mr. Millar, I'll give you the opportunity to go next.
Sure. So, like Mr. Waldron, there's a long list of challenges, but let's call them maybe opportunities. The first of these on an organization level is funding, for sure. The cost of operating for conservation in the Rupununi is very expensive for transport. The communities are far apart. And we are a grassroots, as I said, grassroots conservation NGO. So our money comes from our hard work. We have to apply to individual funders, and sometimes you might spend a whole week just applying for a grant for a small amount of money, and that has to last you. And we're used to working on a shoestring budget. Every single dollar is accounted for, and we try and stretch it as far as it goes. But obviously, the more money we have, the more that we could do. But it's always a very time-consuming thing to spend money applying for grants when you could actually be in the field doing this work. So funding definitely is the number one challenge. The second one I'd say, which is similar to both Ms. Collins and Mr. Waldron's points, is the perception of conservation. So in the communities, you have, especially our SRCS members and rangers, you have enlightened people who understand that wildlife populations are diminishing and there is more degradation of the environment than there used to be. But there's
Okay, it seems like Neal is experiencing some technical difficulties there. Hopefully we'll get him back. So Dr. Maharaj, I'll ask you to respond in the meantime.
So our challenges are similar to some that have been mentioned. One is funding. So what happens with funding is that sometimes there's a focus on a particular taxa. So there's lots of money available for that taxa, and you don't have funding for the other taxa. And those taxa will get ignored during the periods of time that you can't get funding for it. So that's one of the problems we have. The second problem that we have is that sometimes the funding is one-off, or you can only get this type of funding. You only get the opportunity once, and there just aren't similar opportunities. So what happens is that you set the studies, instead of being long-term and instead of being continuous studies, we have these one-off studies. And that's a problem when you are trying to establish before and after data. It's a problem when you're trying to establish trends in your population for whatever it is that you're studying. It's a lot may have happened in that environment. So you really can't say a study that has been done 10 years ago or 20 years ago is indicative of what's happening now within the environment. So that's one of the problems. I think another major problem that we all have is the fact that very little genetic work is done. There is work on the species level, and there is work somewhat on the ecosystem level, but there is very little to no genetic work that's done. So we're not seeing what are the changes that's happening at a genetic level in our communities. And I think that presents a bunch of problems unto itself. And I think my final challenge, and again, there are lots, but I think my final challenge is really publication. and to having all of us, not just the university, but to having all of our organizations, ensure that we are in positions where we are able to publish our data and to share those data among ourselves. And I think this is very important locally, so that, for example, if there is work done at the university, the Wildlife Commission can know, oh, this is work that we're doing and it falls in line with the objectives of the Wildlife Commission, and the Wildlife Commission can come back to us and say, oh, we've also published data in this area and this is something you can incorporate into your study, so there's no need to reinvent the wheel. I think that is a serious problem in our country when it comes to data use, data management, data sharing, and data publication. And I think those are the list for me. As Johann said, it's a very long list, but we do have limited time. So I think those are the 4 major challenges that we have had so far. Thank you.
All right, yes, thank you very much. So Neal, I see you're back with us. Are you actually in the Rupununi right now?
Yes, I'm in the Rupununi, so you can add that to the list of challenges. You could put that right at the top. But just if I could quickly finish.
Yeah.
While some people are not, it's not that they're not supportive of conservation, but really the issue lies in it's people's livelihood. Everybody has to make money. Everybody has to eat. So when we say that there's persons doing overfishing, they're doing overhunting for commercial reasons, they're doing this to make money because that's the resources they have around them. So it's very hard to go in and tell people, not to overfish or not to overhunt when that's how they make their livelihood. So as some of the other panelists have alluded to, what we really need in Guyana is alternative livelihoods, that we can find other ways for these people to make money that benefits wildlife and the environment at the same time. And we also need more jobs related to wildlife, more green jobs, which brings me on to my last challenge, which is capacity. So like I said, my role with SRCS is really now trying to increase the capacity of our organization. And part of that starts at the tertiary education level, because there's a lot of talented persons that finish education here in the Rupununi, but there's a big gap in between finishing secondary here and being able to go to Georgetown to study. And I know that there are more initiatives than there used to be, but not many of these are centered around wildlife and environment. So we'd really like to see, and we like to continue to try and reach out to UG. I'm glad Dr. Maharaj is here. Maybe she could put in a good word for us. That we'd like to see scholarships with the University of Guyana for these students to not only cover their tuition costs, but allow them to have a place at the tertiary dorms, can give them a living allowance and also transportation. And I think if you did that for a few years, within the next 5-10 years, you would see a huge difference in the capacity that you have here in the Rupununi to manage wildlife and the environment. Yeah, I think that's the main 3 for me. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And well, we know that there will always be challenges to our work. But I think, as Neal said, we should maybe look at them as opportunities. I mean, yes, they might present some sort of a barrier or barriers to us actually being able to achieve our goals. But even as we move forward, well, there are ways that we can deal with these challenges. All right. And so the next point of discussion here would be, what key lessons have you learned and would recommend to other organizations focused on wildlife conservation? So for as long as maybe you have been with your organization, or what do you know about wildlife conservation in Guyana as you would have gone about doing your work? What are some of the key lessons that you would have learned that you can actually share with others? Maybe part of CSBD level, maybe there's something you can share with PAC, or maybe SRCS can share with GWCMC, or even other organizations that aren't represented here on this panel. What lessons can you share with them related to wildlife conservation? Dr. Maharaj, I'd like you to go first.
Well, I guess being a lecturer, I have lots of lessons, but there are 2 that I'm going to highlight. One is to train continuously. Do not just train one time and then expect that your staff is now able to deal with all of the new problems that come along 1 year from now, 5 years from now. With the changing technology, certain aspects of studying the environment and studying animals, the methods have changed, methods have updated. Some things are much easier now. And I think what's very important is to train and train continuously. And this is to train your new staff and of course your existing staff. That's one. And two, work with the younger generation. They are the stewards of the environment, and they are the ones who are going to go out there and make a difference. And I'll give you a simple example. Just in this forum, Johann was one of our students. He is a wonderful example of someone who has come through our program and who has made such a big difference for young scientists. And for me, it really, really makes me extremely proud to see that and to know that these are the persons who are going to be taking over from us and who are going to be leading the charge as it comes to conservation and protection of our biodiversity. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Now, Felicia, I'd like you to go next.
Thank you. So for me, I haven't been in this field for quite a long time. So I'm learning as I go along. But from the experience that I have, I can say that I think one of the biggest things that I see and lessons learned, and what I think other agencies need to be mindful of, is to always have that community support and buy-in. Whenever you are working with communities, you're working in the hinterland areas. For us, the Protected Areas Commission, our work is heavily dependent, and we rely a lot on the communities and the people on the ground, as all conservation work is. Because at the end of the day, we can sit in our ivory towers and we can talk about what we should do and what we should not do. But if the people on the ground don't understand why we're doing what we're doing, then it's almost like we haven't done anything at all. So for us, well, for me, I just think other agencies should always remember to put people almost at the center of any awareness program, any research program, and also that speaks to building the capacity of locals, inspiring the younger persons from communities to see and understand the importance of their resources, their species, how it's interconnected, and why it's so important. Also, what I see that I think one of the things, as I mentioned before, that the PAC has done and continues to do is have research priorities. And we also rank them in terms of their, if it's urgent, if it's high, it's medium, it's low. And we have that list there for university students. In the event we get a donor approaches with some funding for a conservation program, we have our priorities there. We already streamlined, what is it we need. And it works out because we benefit because we get our research done to do the work. And then students also gain experience, which can also help to inspire them, maybe just give them that push that they need in the right direction. So I think those are the two biggest lessons learned for me so far. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And well, since you would have mentioned community support is a big one, and I know, Neal, your work is heavily community-based, I'll ask you to go next.
Sure, that's great. All through Felicia's comments and remarks, I was completely agreeing, because it's so true. I had it on my list also, that community engagement is the #1 thing. And it's not just community engagement, it has to be community-led initiatives. That it's clear, like Guyana, even though again, I've not been in conservation so long, Guyana, I've looked back at the projects that have been, and where projects instantly fail is where communities are not the ones to lead projects. If an organization goes in and tries to lead it from afar, it will never work. So really any project has to build the capacity, as Felicia said, of that community. And this is not just in the short term, it kind of leads me on to my second point. It has to have a long-term strategy. Too often, we get projects. They're only funded for maybe 1 or 2 years. And that's the foresight that we have to only think 1-2 years ahead. And then after 2 years, while the money's done, everybody go home, pack up, and the project just falls flat. So really you need to have this long-term vision, because conservation is not an overnight thing. You know, you can't expect to implement a project in a community and 1 year later, wildlife is thriving, new species are being found. It's not so simple as that. It has to, it's 5, 10 years, 20 years to actually see a difference for a lot of species. So you need to have this long-term project and plan. And that's not just about your strategy of what you will do, it's also about how you will secure the funding along the way. Because you can't really rely on funding the whole time. You need to develop projects that's going to be able to develop its own finance mechanism, so that so long as the project is successful, it'll be able to bring money back in. And the final key lesson I think we've definitely learned that Dr. Maharaj talked on previously is collaboration. That she used the exact same expression that I am now tired of myself saying about reinventing the wheel, because that's all we seem to see a lot, not just in the Rupununi, but in Guyana. That, you know, we will be aware of a project that will come and they will tell SRCS about it. And you'll say, well, that project was done in this village 10 years ago. These are the lessons learned. But by then, the project's already been implemented. It's too late. So I really think something that we could do as partners, I mean, this is obviously a great steps forward that we have these panel discussions, but we really need a national kind of coordination group for environmental conservation wildlife groups, so we can share ideas, share data where possible, that we can synthesize, make more collaborations, so we can actually make more of an impact and have more of a long-lasting effect for our wildlife and across Guyana.
Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Waldron.
Maybe 2.5, 3 points, building a lot on what both Ms. Collins and Dr. Maharaj have said in terms of engagement, as well as what Mr. Millar would have said as well. Engagement is invaluable, doesn't seem strong enough of a word to describe it. And drawing on Felicia's example again, when she said, you know, we could stay in our ivory towers and say X, Y, and Z, but the folk on the ground that know what's going on. A lot of the times when you, especially if you're going out of Georgetown, one of the first things that you hear is that, oh, you come from town, you know what Guyana, right? That's the first thing that you hear. Especially in some cases, if it's a day whereby, you know, you didn't really cater for not leaving the office. So, you know, you got on your shoes, your dress pants, long sleeve shirt, neatly tucked in. People immediately look at you and say, oh, you're the office boy, man. You ain't know about none, all you know about this book. And I mean, while, you know, great pleasure is taken in showing them, well, hey, don't let a fancy shirt and the dress pants and the shiny shoes fool you. Not just office boy. One of the things that I've learned is very important is letting the persons know that, look, sure, I may speak, or as people say, you may speak fancy, or you might talk proper English. It's what a lot of that's what you get told a lot as well. And people tend to think that you immediately know. I remember in one instance doing an engagement with the guy. I think we were responding to an incident, a conflict incident, and the man said to me, he's like, well, you know, is you come from town and thing, you know, is you gotta tell me? I'm like, no, not because I come from town, you know. Remember, you was the one dealing with this thing every day. You were the one that's here, right? I just came because, well, hey, we got a call from the office saying you were having this problem, but I am here to learn from you. Just as you can learn from me, I can learn from you as well, right? And once you dispel that sort of, oh, you must know because you come from the fancy organization or you come from town, once you dispel that and let it be known that, well, look, I can teach you, you can teach me, let us both learn, you find that you have a completely different kind of interaction. So engagement is paramount, but also setting the tone for that engagement is where you can also see better relationships and partnerships being formed. All right. So engagement for sure. Adaptive management is also extremely, extremely important, because what you find in many instances is that while there is a structured or well outlined way of doing something based on what you encounter on the ground, that way may not always prove suitable. Right? And so being able to employ adaptive management again becomes paramount to being efficient, as well as ensuring continuity. Because, for example, let's say we got called to resolve some jaguar conflict somewhere out of town. And our immediate suggestion is, oh, let's put up a corral, keep the animals in the corral. And the jaguars learn, well, hey, you know, we could jump over the corral, we could dig a little bit, go under the corral. That one outline method then becomes inefficient because it no longer prevents what it was you were trying to prevent in the first place. So then what do? You incorporate, you know, put up some bells, put up a few flashing lights, something that adds to what it is that you're trying to do. It may not always be outlined as a referenced method or as a documented method, but based on the situation that you encounter at the localized level. Your ability to adapt what you know, as well as the conditions, plays a key part in ensuring that what it is you're trying to do is efficient. Also, be willing to teach. There have been instances where, for example, in Diamond, there was a woman that had called us because there was a caiman that resided under a culvert right next to her house. And the caiman would come out from time to time and would be basking at the side of the road on the parapet. And her grandchildren would be playing. And so when we got there, she's like, y'all got to do something about the caiman. The children be outside playing and they're going to eat the children, you know, almost to the point of hysteria. We're like, man, no, man, what do you mean? Oh, the caiman eat the children, man. What do you mean? Right? And she's like, yes, they said them things eat children and them things. I'm like, man, no, man. And then, you know, you essentially embark on a lesson of sorts. So you teach her about the caiman, you teach her about the caiman's behavior, what it is that the caiman eats primarily, how it is that the caiman will go about eating, why it is that the caiman is asking. And what you find is that with that willingness to teach, persons then move from a state of hysteria closer to a state of curiosity and acceptance, or acceptance of coexistence, versus get rid of it, versus kill it, versus run it over, versus cook it. And sometimes what you can encounter is people being unwilling to teach for, I'm not sure what reason. So being willing to teach, ensuring that you are engaged, both between organizations, outside of organizations, within your field of expertise, your local populations, persons on the ground are extremely key in ensuring that anything that you try to implement or do is sustainable and is actually effective. And be willing to teach, whether it's persons from a prior generation or younger generation, you have to be willing to teach, because as I would have mentioned before, conservation is not a one-man job, and it's definitely not a one-generation job. So a lot of, for me, based on what I've learned in my years in the field, a lot of success or a lot of perpetuity of conservation is based on approach and your ability to form relationships and affect change in perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those responses. And you know, those are quite comprehensive lessons there that we can share with other organizations. But what definitely stood out to me would be, well, two of them, the part about community engagement, ensuring that there's community buy-in, and also, especially for organizations that are based in Georgetown. When we go to other areas, especially in the rural areas, it's not that we are going there to teach the people or to show them how this is done. The people on the ground, they are there, and they know the best conditions and everything about the situation, and so their support is very vital, right? And also collaboration between organizations. I think that Dr. Maharaj would have mentioned, it's not CSBD doing something and not wanting to share with the GWCMC or SRCSs in Rupununi, and so they're like, oh, we're in Rupununi, Shell Beach is in Region 1, so there's no reason for us to tell them what we are doing or for us to share any sort of information. And so, because there are still things that we can learn from each other and even partner on in some way or the other. And so those are two key lessons that, well, for me personally, that I would have taken away from the discussion that you guys would have shared just now. And so we'll now move on to our final question, and that is, what are the gaps in advancing wildlife conservation in Guyana? So basically, what do you think needs to be done to improve wildlife conservation in Guyana? And I leave this one as a bit of an open mic, so anyone can go and respond.
I think Dr. Maharaj may have mentioned earlier where there is that lack of interagency collaboration, and it's definitely, holding all of us back. As you mentioned as well, a lot of us feel like we have to reinvent the wheel so many times, and that's not it. Like the data is in some cases it is there, but we withhold it from each other, and by extension, we kind of stifle not just our own agency's development, but Guyana as a whole. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges in advancing wildlife, is that we don't collaborate and communicate enough to share data, what we have, what we're doing, what are our priorities, what is it that we need, and just be more in support of each other.
I think one of the things that has come out, not just with the PSC or with the SRCS, or even Johann's stories with the Wildlife Commission, I think what has come out is that there is a need for citizen science, and not just about going into communities, whether it's coastal communities or interior communities, and collecting data, but to ensure that they are a part of that process from the beginning. So what are their needs? And this is for all of these communities. And how can we work with you to address those needs? I think when you have buy-in from the people that live within these areas, I think that is when you are going to have the best outcomes when it comes to your conservation goals. One of the things that I think is also necessary is to work with communities where we teach them not just how to collect the data, but how to analyze these data so that they can use this information on their own. So they don't see it as we're coming there to gather information and then we're just telling them a story. It's something where they're involved in every process. So the collection, the analysis of this data, and then the narrative that is told from these data. So what is this data? What are these data indicating? And everybody's a part of it. And I think once everybody's a part of it, you'll have far more buy-in from your stakeholders, that's one. And two, I think that we'll actually meet our conservation goals much faster. And that's it for me. Thank you.
I would completely support what Dr. Maharaj said. There's a complete priority for us about building the capacity not just about collecting data, but being able to analyze the data, because that's something that's just not always there. And I think that harks back to further education and scholarships and so on. And even related to that, which touches on a couple of points mentioned throughout this discussion, is environmental education. So we, SRCS, have developed an environmental education curriculum that we are implementing to more than 500 students and 12 communities here in the Rupununi. And it came about because, you know, we live in Guyana as a country rich with biodiversity, but as I think Mr. Waldron talked earlier, that people are not very aware of the wildlife exists or how important it is. So this curriculum we developed was not only to teach kids about scientific knowledge about the species they have, why it's important to protect them, techniques we can do this, but also to preserve traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge. Because as time has gone on, indigenous people a few generations ago, they had this knowledge of how to manage the land, about the wildlife. And now with, I guess you could call it the modernization of a lot of indigenous communities, the younger generation, while they're interested, this knowledge is not being passed on to them. So this environmental education curriculum was one way of doing this. An important thing with the curriculum is there was a local context, because sometimes in school, children are learning about giraffes and rhinos and elephants, and we don't have those in Guyana. You know, we should be learning about the species that we have here. So that curriculum has been good to help students learn more about their local community and the wildlife that they have. And even related to that, my final point in terms of gaps is about the biodiversity that we have in Guyana. You know, while assessments have been done, we actually, I think, still have very limited knowledge of the species that exist in the country. Most recently, we just published a book about mammals that you find in the Rupununi, and we worked with scientists to help compile the book. And in the book, we listed one species, we listed a rabbit. Most people in Guyana will say, oh, we don't have rabbits in Guyana, when in fact, if you go to some communities here in the South Rupununi, they'll say, yes, I can tell you we have rabbits because they destroy my farm and they're a nuisance. So there is this gap between, and even a rabbit, according to the IUCN status, is endangered, you know, but that wouldn't feature on Guyana's protected species list, but it should. So there are these gaps between the species that we know that are here and the ones we don't. So we really need to, I guess it's through more biodiversity assessments, and new tools and technology are coming out all the time that make that so much easier. You know, you have eDNA now that should make this a simple fix. So once you know the species that exist in your country, well, then you can start to take the steps to manage it in a sustainable way.
All right, well, just for a bit of clarity, the question was what can be done to improve wildlife conservation in Guyana?
Yes.
Supporting all that is said thus far, 100% behind it in terms of better data sharing and data sharing mechanisms between organizations, definitely more engagement, definitely more education and awareness. And not just education and awareness that aims to get the message out there, but education and awareness that gets the message out there effectively, efficiently, and it leaves a lasting impression, which reflects in an obvious change in perception. For example, I'm sure Dr. Maharaj and I'm pretty sure Mr. Hughes and possibly Ms. Collins as well. I'm not sure if Mr. Millar would have been in Guyana long enough, but I'm pretty sure everybody remembers the Deck Salt song, right? All right. Everybody remembers the type of music that was played on Channel 13 during the R&R toilet tissue and water tank advertisements, right? Good. So messages like that are not only catchy, but that make an impact, right? And I mean, everybody was walking around at one point singing a Deck Salt song and teasing each other about using Deck Salt as well. So, and I think that falls to us, the agencies that are involved and essentially in charge and with whom the mantle has been placed for wildlife conservation, to not only ensure that our aims at communication with each other and our populace are in place, but also effective and subject to constant revision. because something that may have been implemented 5 years ago can be improved upon year by year as years go by. And that is where, again, adaptive management plays in. Also, how we communicate with our populace is of key importance, right? Like what is it that we want them to take away? How do we want them to see a snake and not let their first instinct be, hey, bring the cutlass or pass the piece of wood? All right, so better communication management skills on our part in terms of how we communicate with each other, as well as how we communicate with our populace in general. And also, not only a species-specific approach, but an appreciation for the ecosystem which the flora and fauna and we ourselves form a part. So we're not only looking at the jaguars, we're not only looking at the sea turtles, we're not only looking at the red siskin. How are we managing, or how are we entreating with, how are we engaging with entities and companies and persons that are engaged in activities that can impact the trees in which the red siskins nest, the route which the leatherbacks take to get to Shell Beach? You know, how are we interacting with those persons as well, because they are also our stakeholders. And I once came across something that said, if left alone, nature by itself will survive. Humans, on the other hand, are dependent on nature for, or we are dependent on nature for our survival. Regardless of how it's twisted and turned, at the end of the day, we are. And failure to consider or failure to acknowledge the importance of an ecosystem approach, an overall ecosystem approach, and not just a species-based approach, can prove detrimental to all efforts. Because while, yes, you are going to focus on the species, you are going to focus on the factors that affect it, how does that species in itself affect the factors and other species around it? That too is something that, in my view, would require increasing emphasis in continuing wildlife conservation and how effective and efficient our efforts are going to be to conserve wildlife and to safeguard our own existence as well. Thank you.
So thank you very much for those views. And indeed, up to this point, this has been a very engaging and informative conversation. But even as we now are almost bringing it to an end, I'll just give each of you maybe about 30 seconds to just give your closing thoughts on the theme, on your work, how you see Guyana moving forward in terms of wildlife conservation. So your closing thoughts.
I think that from all of us, we realize that we have similar challenges, but we also have many opportunities with working together to achieve protection of our biodiversity. I think what has also been pointed out, but hasn't been explicitly stated, is the need for interdisciplinary research and to ensure that we capture not just the biologists or not just the environmental scientists, but we capture the persons in communication, we capture the persons in social sciences who look at human behavior. So I guess to close off, I just want to say that as we move forward and as we continue with our conservation efforts, that I do hope that there's more collaboration throughout our agencies and just in general. Thank you.
Again, agreeing with Dr. Maharaj in terms of more collaborative approach and definitely interdisciplinary research, as well as more involvement from conservation agencies and folk affiliated with conservation in terms of legislative endeavors as well. Definitely a need for increased representation on that front. And with with collaboration, with better engagement with legislations and legislators, as well as support both locally and internationally, I do believe that wildlife conservation is something that can be achieved and maintained in Guyana, and in and across Guyana, both for the terrestrial and marine ecosystems.
I would like to first, I agree with the collaboration. I'd like to extend an invitation to the panelists, anyone else watching, if they want to come to visit SRCS to see our work, to see our projects, everyone is welcome anytime. Felicia has already been, I'm sure she really enjoyed herself. And actually, speaking of collaboration, we had a reciprocal visit where one of our senior rangers went to Shell Beach and he learned a lot, and that's actually helped us to improve our methodology, although it's for river turtles, by quite a lot just from that experience. But I guess my closing remarks and points to what we are seeing on the ground at the community level is that going forward for conservation to be successful, we need community-led initiatives, we need alternative livelihoods, and we need green jobs, because without those, what else are people supposed to do? You know, if we enact legislation, policies, rules about people can't do this, can't do that, well, I mean, what options do we leave people with? You know, we really need to be using the income generated now in this changing country, income earned from things like carbon credits, to reward the people who are surrounded by wildlife and are really the stewards and the guardians of it.
So I would first like to thank you for having me here today. And definitely agreeing with what everyone would have just said, you know, there is need for more collaboration and capacity building within our agencies. So we continue to do our research program at the Shell Beach Protected Area, where we do encourage other agencies, key stakeholder agencies, to participate in our monitoring program. But also, I think it is important for us to remember that conservation, it's not just about the protection of species and habitats, but also about livelihood development. And that's something that we always try to be mindful of when we go out there to do our work. As I would have said before, at the end of the day, we can talk about conservation, but if we don't get that support, you know, our work just wouldn't be as meaningful as.
All right, thank you very much thank you all for agreeing to be a part of this panel discussion. And again, I'm just going to reiterate that, at least for me personally, it has been a very informative discussion to hear about the work that each organization has been doing relating to wildlife conservation in Guyana. And I would like to think that many of our viewers out there as well would have also learned a lot, and even other organizations can take lessons from the discussions that you guys would have had in terms of advancing the work of wildlife conservation in Guyana. And so once again, thank you to you all, and I just want to commend you on the work that has been done thus far, but of course, it's not complete. We still have more to achieve in terms of wildlife conservation in Guyana, and just to wish you all success in your future endeavors. And hopefully it doesn't just stop here at this discussion, but of course, hopefully the conversation can continue among our viewers, among other organizations. And of course, we're looking forward to collaboration among organizations so that we can indeed say that we are achieving the protection of the key species here in Guyana that are so important to providing for us as humans and to ensuring that we have a high quality life. So once again, thank you. And viewers, thank you for tuning in.